Well, let me introduce briefly Professor Hartmut Rosa, who will begin to speak and provide us with an overview of his analysis. And Professor Rosa is a very distinguished professor from Friedrich Schiller Jena University in Germany, but also director of the Max Weber College, which is a center of advanced studies in Germany. He came to prominence with an important book that was much discussed on the question of time and the use of time in late capitalism, the acceleration theory, and identify several of the problems that we encounter looking at a very traditional concept in critical theory, which is how we deal with alienation, in this case, connected with the same question of time. And then later on, in a very important book that we are going to discuss in more detail today, he began to look at the possibility of encountering our relationship with the world in such a way that facilitates to overcome some of the great dilemmas of alienation, and began to talk about a concept that sounds at first time a concept from the physics, which is resonance. But that concept then began to play a major role in understanding the axis of resonance that cross our life and impact our way of thinking and acting. So without further ado, I thank Professor Rosa for his willingness to make a presentation. After that, I will begin to ask 6 questions, which he already have, and then we will open for a conversation to the rest of us with more questions. So Professor Rosa, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carlos Torres, for this very kind introduction, and also to Antonio and Ines and everyone else involved for giving me the opportunity to talk, not just, I hope, not just to you, but with you, and have an interesting discussion today, also in particular on the connection and on a comparison between Paulo Freire and my own pedagogy of resonance, or yeah, we call it pedagogy of resonance, right? And I think in the German tradition, of course, we have the concept of Bildung, right? Which I think is not just pedagogy, right? But which, in my view, comes very close to what Paulo Freire means and talks about with Bildung, and Carlos and others. Also, I did prepare in my. I will now give a presentation of about, let's say, 45 minutes, no more than an hour. I have to slow down a bit, I know. But I did prepare some slides, so I will try to share my screen with you. It should be this one. Oh. So can you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Okay, right. So it's on this workshop, right? I called it the talk between the need for speed, which is the dominant concept, not just of social reproduction, of the way our societies operate, but also probably of our dominating conceptions of pedagogy or education in the schools, right? And I believe there is a human desire. It's almost, I would claim it's an anthropological feature that there is the need for, or the desire for, being in resonance with the world we live in and we interact with. And it's resonance, I will point out in this lecture, is a form of relating to other people, but also to our own bodies, being in resonance with oneself, to the nature, to nature around us, but also to the built environment around us. And for example, in work, there can be a relationship of resonance, like Karl Marx would have pointed out, but also people like Hannah Arendt, for example. and many others, that in working we establish a relationship to the world, and what is needed there, and I think Freire was very much aware of this, is a sense of self-efficacy, right, and also a sense of autonomy, of authorship at least, right, which leads to successive transformation of self and the world. And that's the conception of resonance I want to talk about, right? I mean, these two, I have these two, the images you see here. I have taken them from my analysis of modern society, which is which for me, modern society it's not a normative concept, right? It's certainly not something we should aspire to be or so. And I think it's not a Western concept, right? But it has become now, it's a structural conception. I will give you the definition in a minute. But for me, a very important feature of this modern society is acceleration, setting the world in motion in an accelerating sense. So it looks like this locomotive from the Motorhead cover, or Gasmatron, because it's not just like a machine. It also is kind of playing on our desires, or capturing our desires and our let's call it our desires, but it might lead to alienated and burned out subjects like you see here on the right side. So basically I just have two parts, right? At first I want to point out to you the conception of dynamic stabilization, which characterizes modern society. But by doing this, I will talk also about the role of education, about a pedagogy, because I believe that this kind of society needs a certain form of subject. And these subjects are formed in educational contexts, which I think Freire calls the banking model of education, right? And to me, this leads to actually to a mode of aggression towards other people, towards nature, and in the end towards ourselves. So the second step will be an alternative mode, what I would call the pedagogy of resonance, the Resonanz als Bildungskonzept, as a conception of education. And this connects, I believe, to a kind of, if you so like, to human nature, or at least to a human desire. All right, so let's start with the first part. So in my view, in my conception, a society can be called modern when its mode of stabilization is dynamic. This means we can call a society modern when it systematically requires material growth, technological acceleration, and cultural innovation to reproduce its structure and to maintain the institutional status quo. Now, what that means, I think, is very easy. You see this in Brazil. I think there are people here, right, from Brazil, but also in Portugal and in the United States, or in China, or in Germany, right? In all of these places, we kind of live in a socioeconomic reality, which permanently needs to increase, to accelerate, to grow, and to innovate in order to maintain its structure. Right? In the US, like in Germany, in Brazil, Portugal, or China, we lose jobs, our companies close down if we don't achieve growth. And even if we don't achieve growth, like in Japan, we permanently need to innovate and to accelerate, right? To have the fastest car, or the fastest production of maybe not cars, right? But because cars don't have to be fast, but we need to produce them in fast ways and to make them as efficient and cheap as possible, and so on. So there's the permanent need to become better, right? The need for optimization, for rationalization, or what I call the need for increase. But you can very easily really bring it down to also to the logic of economic growth. It means year by year, we have to produce more, to distribute more, and to consume more, just to keep the system alive. And when I say the system alive, I mean with it not just the economic system, because you know, we cannot pay the old age pensions, and we cannot maintain the health insurance schemes. We cannot actually afford the educational institutions without this, without becoming better, right? Becoming faster, achieving growth and innovating. So for all of us, it's true that if we don't run faster next year, we will go down the drain, so to speak, right? Or you can also put it the other way around. No matter how fast we run this year, next year we have to run a little faster in order to maintain what we have. And that's true on an individual level, right? For individuals, it's like standing on downward escalators. If you don't run, if you don't improve with your publications, with your educate, with your teaching, with your third-party funding and so on, right? You will comparatively lose ground to others. So this logic, just keep the image in mind, standing on a downward escalator means as soon as you kind of take a break or relax, it's like the escalator is putting you downward, right? Moving you down, so you lose ground compared to those around you, right? It's like you stand on the escalator looking upwards and the escalator puts you down, so you permanently have to run in order to keep your place in the world, your share of the world, you could say, right? To stay in place. Now this actually, I wasn't sure whether I should include this, but I thought, well, maybe I can show you quickly what I call what for me kind of is the heart of this logic of modernization, the processes of acceleration. And there are in fact 3 dimensions of acceleration. One is technological acceleration. So we speed up in transport, in communication, but also in the production of goods and services. And when I say we, of course, it's always fair to ask who is we, right? I would really say, you look at the kind of at the structures of transport, of communication and production in Brazil, in Portugal, in China, in the US, or in Germany, right? So you see, for example, there's a permanent, it's really setting the world in motion, literally, not just by the trains which came first and the steamships, right? So it was so the railway net was increasing, the steamships net was increasing. There were more and more locomotives, more and more trains, more and more ships, until this day, right? And so it's the ships, it's the railways, but then of course it's the cars, it's the number of trucks. The number of trucks is exploding all over the world, right? And even the number of ships is still rising, but then also the number of subways and the subway cars, right? And even the number of bicycles. The bicycle is a modern invention. Technologically, we could have done it much earlier, but it was invented in modernity. So, so even this is part of the modern story. And then, of course, there come the planes, the airplanes, right, all around us. So modernization is setting the world in motion, literally, in transport and communication. You think of smartphones and these things, but also in the sense of production. The Industrial Revolution was an acceleration, a revolution of acceleration. But then when we talk, you know, and this is relevant for pedagogy. I know that the topic is pedagogy, right? But I talk about, you know, for me, it's the interesting question. I mean, Bildung, pedagogy, if you so like, education, is about somehow creating a fit between subjects and the structures of the world. And both are not just given, they are created, right? But the banking model of education creates subjects which fit into this form of society, acceleration society, or as I call it now, a society which can only stabilize itself, reproduce itself dynamically. So when we talk about acceleration, it's not just the acceleration of transport, it's also the acceleration of social change. The world does not stay the same, right? We have to relearn in almost all aspects of our lives, right? We can call this an increase in the decay rates of knowledge. So for example, I think of the book in which you have the addresses of people, right? So people move frequently, but they also change their addresses, they change their smartphone numbers, they change their email address, and so on. That's just one dimension, right? But also the technology we work with changes, the products we produce changes, the products we use changes, but also the patterns of association change, right? Who is associated with whom, privately or in the professional world, and so on. So in short, the logic of modernity is connected to an increase in the rates of change. The world does not stay the same. And then there is the third dimension, which is the acceleration of the pace of life, right? And that's a little paradoxical, because normally you would suppose if you have fast technologies, you can go from one place to the other in a very short amount of time, then you should be able to relax. You don't have to walk for 2 hours, you just take the car, that's 10 minutes. So you gain 1 minute and 1 hour and 50 minutes for free time, right? But in fact, modernity, it's very strange. This is how I started on all of this. It was the insight, the so-called Linda paradox, that the richer modern societies get, or people get, you could even say, the poorer they become with respect to time, right? So wealth in goods and wealth in time are, so to speak, related in an opposite and a proportional way, right? The richer you become in goods, the poorer you become in time, and the other way around. It might not be completely true. There are some people who are super rich and do have a lot of time. But for most, actually, it's interesting, even within so-called modern societies, right? It's true that the amount of time people feel they have, right, varies with their wealth, with their income. And interestingly, the more money they have, the less time they feel. I mean, we know that it's not completely true. If people who are quite poor have to have 3 or 4 jobs in modern societies to sustain themselves, then of course they are short on money and short on time. But for most, for societies writ large and all over the world, it's true that the modernity is characterized by a shortage of time, which is paradox given that they are technologically in the technological realm, we are so efficient and so fast, right? So this has turned into an acceleration cycle. My explanation for this, why are we short on time when we are getting faster and faster technologically? There's a twofold explanation. One is what I call the acceleration cycle, which means that it's become a kind of self-propelling accelerational system. Technology is driving social change, and social change, you see, from 1 to 2, and social change means that that the world does not stay the same. It's changing faster and faster. So we have to run faster and faster just to stay in place. And when we are short on time, we ask for faster technologies, right? So it's become a kind of self-propelling cycle. But there are what I call 3 external motors. One is capitalism, if you so like. It's the economic motor. If time is money, then of course time is always short. And we invest time in things, right? That's why I think that's why Freire talks about the banking model of education. It's also investing time in order to get a return, but a return of a certain form. So capitalism, you could say, is one driving motor. Then also what I call functional differentiation, or you could actually call it the division of labor, the fact that there are more and more arenas in which we have to run. It's not just one downward escalator where you have to run upwards. It's many downward escalators. So what do I mean by this, right? You have to keep up in the educational methodologies and educational topics. You have to keep up with your friends on Facebook or Snapchat or Instagram or what it is. I mean, a downward escalator is good. You can imagine it, see it very easily with the logic of Snapchat. If you don't send pictures fast enough, the flame will die down, right? So all the time you have to be, that's dynamic stabilization, right? And since there are more and more downward escalators, the acceleration game is going on. So functional differentiation is a motor, but there is also a certain cultural conception which is driving the logic of acceleration. You know, we are not just the victims of acceleration. We are also, if you so like, we are the perpetrators, the actors. And that's because we somehow connect acceleration with happiness, increasing our share of the world, our horizon of what is available or attainable or accessible. I call it the AAA conception of the good life, is propelling us into this world. And it's also the fear of death. There are interesting books by the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg, for example, who says that acceleration is one way of dealing with the problem of death, of finitude, of mortality, right? Because we all know that we will die one day. And this means that we cannot meet all the people we would like to meet, or have all the experiences we would like to have, or see all the places we would like to see. Our time is limited. But if we live twice as fast, we can double the share of our lives, right? We can meet twice as many people, go twice as many places, do twice as many things. So by accelerating, we can have 2 lives within one. And if we become indefinitely fast, we can have an eternal life before death, right? So there are kind of 3 motors propelling the system. And this is why this is, for me, is the iron cage Max Weber talks about, right? Now let's turn to pedagogy and education, right? I mean, my claim is that schools, the banking model of schools, is what produces subjects which accelerate, innovate, and achieve growth, right? So what I tried to tell you already is that the dynamic, the logic of dynamic stabilization means that society have to achieve growth, acceleration, and innovation year by year. But societies can't do anything and institutions can't do anything, right? Even a company cannot do anything. It's the people working in the company who have to accelerate, innovate, and achieve growth, right? So for me, this is very important. This is why I think we cannot just stay with the structural description of modern society. It's a society which is dynamic. It permanently has to increase, accelerate, and so on. But we have to look at the subjects, because it's the subjects which drive this. I mean, I always I try to make the point. I'm writing on this recently. It has something to do with energy, right? To keep the process of dynamic stabilization going, we need to invest more and more physical energy, coal-based, carbon-based, but also nuclear-based, or maybe solar-based, or so on. But we need to come up year by year with more physical energy, but also with more psychic energy. It's our energy which needs to be invested, right? Otherwise, the logic of increase, acceleration, growth would not go. So schools, I would claim, systematically produce the subjects which then run on the downward escalators, right? Which accelerate, innovate, and achieve growth year by year. Now, how do they do this? I mean, one basic element of this, of course, is the logic of competition, right? I mean, of course, modern societies are, at least when they are capitalist, but probably also some way beyond this. They are based on the logic of competition, right? And competition has this inherently dynamic factor. You know, I always make this, not always, but sometimes make this argument. If, let's say, if we meet for a run, right, for a race in Lisbon, let's say today, and we want to see who wins, the winner gets something very nice. I don't know what, a treat to a trip to Los Angeles, maybe, where Carlos is right now. Then maybe, let's say you would win, right? One of you would win. And then the next year, if we do it again, I would bring my best shoes, right? And my best, I don't know, a nice shirt or so in order to win. And then maybe I would win. So the year after that, you will start to practice a bit, right? You will run in the weeks before our race 3 or 4 times, and then you are in better shape and you would win. So the year after that, I would run every week, right, in the whole year, and I maybe change my nourishment in order to win. And of course, you see where this goes. It doesn't have an end, right? Sooner or later, we would take to drugs and doping in order to win the race, right? So competition has this inherent logic of increase. And if you look at our educational systems in the global scale, you see how they hammer competition into our minds. You see it with the PISA system of the OECD, right, where they measure the skills of students in mathematics, in writing, in understanding, and so on. And then they compare the systems. They compare countries. How is Portugal doing? How is Spain doing? How is China doing in the PISA logic? So we rank on the national level, and it's always driven by anxiety. Oh my God, the Americans are much better than we are. So we have to invest more energy to stay in the race. But it's not just countries. We compare and rank and measure in individual schools or universities, right? There's a global ranking of universities all over the world. In China, they know this very well too, right? So there is competition between every university, right? And I call this, parametric optimization. We define more and more parameters of our lives, which I mean, at first you define a parameter. For example, how many publications do you have, right, in your universities, right? Then, of course, we find the parameter. It's not just publications, it's publications in A-level journals or something of this sort, right? So you have a parameter. And as soon as you have that, you start to compare it. At least you can compare it, right? Oh, how are my colleagues doing? How is this other university doing? How are we doing on a national scale, right? So the first thing is making a parameter visible. The second is make it comparable or compare it. And the third is manipulate it. people in China, in Los Angeles, in Germany, of course, in Portugal and in Brazil, we try to improve our standings on these scales all the time. Right? So universities are ranked not just along the parameter of publication, but also along the parameters of how many dissertations do you get, how many international scholars do you have, how many students, or not just how many, but also the quality of research money you create and so on. And even on an individual level, students are ranked. And by the way, not just nowadays, not just in university, sometimes even in schools. You ask who is number one in this class, who is number two, who number three, and so on. So one way of creating these subjects which are geared towards acceleration, innovation, and growth is through the mode of competition. And then, of course, competition is done through the logic of accumulating skills, right? You could really say, if you look at an individual, actually, let's say we look at an individual level for a second, what students learn, or anyone entering into educational systems, pedagogical systems of this sort, is what we can describe with Pierre Bourdieu, who of course knows a lot about education, right? We really hammer it into our young minds that they need to run for social, cultural, and bodily, and of course economic capital, right? But in schools, of course, you accumulate social skills, right? How to make contact friends and so on, how to persist in dialogical competition, cultural skills of all sorts, but also bodily skills. You have to be healthy, you have to look nice, you have to be trained, and so on, right? So it's amazing how much we are really obsessed with all the time trying to increase the basis of capital, including economic capital. But as we know from Bourdieu too, is that the educational institutions, the schools and so on, they seem to be kind of, not completely, but somehow the educational process is not so much related to the accumulation of economic capital. Even so, of course, economic capital plays a role here too. Now, I already said this, right? I believe it's the logic of parametric optimization which really has come to define our lives in total, not just in the educational system. It is amazing. Wherever you look in our world, it has a lot to do with the logic of digitalization, of course, now, right? With the digitalization, we have come to kind of measure the quality of life, you could say, or the quality of our lives in terms of our bodies, in terms of our relationships, in terms of our performance and achievements, right? So think of our bodies, right? I mean, we define a whole gamut of parameters which we watch, observe, and then compare and manipulate, right? For example, it's become a modern obsession. Of course, that's a modern thing. No one did it before modernity, right? To steps on the scales and see our weight, right? How heavy or how light we are. So a lot of people permanently every day, they step on their scales and try to keep a certain weight, right? Not to become too heavy. But that's not the only thing. A lot of people nowadays measure their steps, the number of steps you have taken, right? So it should be 10,000. That's a parameter. I mean, the parameter is the number of steps. Almost no one measured it before modern technologies. But once you know it, my cell phone simply measures it by itself. And since I found it very interesting to look at it, right? So that's a second parameter. Now, a lot of people permanently measure their blood pressure, a third parameter, right? And now the pulse rates, right? Are now the quality of sleep. Smartwatches measure the quality of your sleep. How long did you sleep? How deep did you sleep? And so on. And of course, you can measure an incredible amount of parameters in your body and with your body of what you can do. You can also measure your muscles and so on. So we define more and more parameters, and we think life gets better if we improve on these parameters, right? And it's not just bodily parameters. It's how many friends do you have? How many connections do you have? How many high-ranking connections, right? How many likes did you get? How often was the article you wrote cited, quoted, shared, distributed, and so on? So you see in our professional lives, what's your publication rate, what's your impact level, what's your third-party funding, your third-party money funding rates you achieved, and so on. And so we define parameters and we try to improve and manipulate them. And actually, this is what schools already teach their students, right? There is a gamut of skills which we can measure by giving grades, for example. And the logic is you compare what should you have. If you get a good grade, you are kind of fulfilling the norm. If you don't fulfill the norm. So you try to work on it, manipulate it, right? And this, I claim, creates basically a mode of aggression. But then I would still claim, I mean, I'm not an expert on Freire. This is why I'm looking forward to discussing it with you. But this is how I think he understands the bank. This is connected to the banking model of education, right? In my view, I call it really pedagogy leads, this kind of pedagogy leads to a mode of aggression towards the world, right? I mean, it's in the classroom, right? Basically, the teacher, normally that's the way it does, right, presents something which becomes a kind of object of aggression. You have to understand it, you have to acquire the skills to deal with it, to know it, to solve the problem, and so on. But I think, and then I claim this is generalized, right? This is creating the subjects needed for the logic of dynamic stabilization or social acceleration. My idea is that our basic stance towards the world, our basic orientation towards the world, is a mode of aggression, right? I mean, think of how we get up in the morning, right? I mean, getting up and laying down to sleep is one form of being in with the world. Actually, when you go to sleep at night, right, you really have to have the trust that the world will carry you, right? It will not kill you overnight. It will still be there tomorrow. Of course, if you distrust the world, you will have difficulties to fall asleep. You might need sleeping pills then. But how do we get up? We do not get up when we wake up because we have slept enough, or when the sun comes up, which has been the model of getting up for millennia, right? But we get up when the alarm clock rings. Right? It's no chance that we call it alarm clock. You are alarmed, right? That means because the bus is coming, the lecture is starting, or some task has to be fulfilled, the kid has to go to school, and so on. So the moment you get up, you're kind of in a mode of aggression. The bus is coming, I have to hurry up, right? And then, of course, the mode of aggression really comes to you in the form of the to-do list, what you have to do that day. And we know that the to-do list, even for children, is exploding almost all over the world. I mean, if it's not exploding, it's not a good sign either, because then it means that you've been left out. You're no longer standing on the downward escalator. You have already been pushed out of it, right? But that means, of course, that you get further and further behind. But for most people, at least in the middle classes, right, there's a list of things to do which is exploding. And this is a puzzling part of our modern acceleration game. Why is our to-do list exploding? Well, it's exploding because, I mean, it's not, I was really always wondering, is it because I just don't get enough? I cannot say no or so. I think that's not right. It's exploding because the number of expectations which you consider legitimate in one situation or the other is increasing, right? So I really think we have to understand this. What is a legitimate expectation? For example, take a kid, maybe in some, I don't know, maybe in Rio de Janeiro, right? So of course, when he is in mathematics, the teacher or she, the teacher might ask, could you please do this calculation or solve the problem? And then, of course, the student feels that she should have learned it. She feels guilty. Yes, I should have done it. But in the next in the next hour or so, it's not about mathematics, it's about history. So the teacher will ask, when was the First World War? Then, of course, the student feels, yes, I should know this. I'm bad. I'm not good at history. So these are two things where you feel it's a legitimate expectation put on you, right? But then you might, but of course, if you're middle class, right, then of course people will ask you, well, what do you do for sports? And then the student might feel bad again. Yeah, I know I don't do enough sports. I should do more. I should practice more, maybe for soccer or whatever it is. And then someone will come along with a piano and ask, well, did you practice piano lessons? Then, of course, the student will say, oh shit, I did not practice enough for the piano lesson. Then the mother comes along and said, oh, did you do the household chores I wanted you to do, or buy the loaf of bread? Then you feel that this is a legitimate expectation, right? Then your friends will ask you, why didn't you send me your Snapchat message, right? Our flame has died. And you feel, oh, I should have done this. It's true, right? And so on, even for students. And it's even worse for grown-ups, right? From one situation to the other, we always feel, yes, I should have done this, right? So you go to the doctor and the doctor says, did you relax a bit, right? And you will probably say, unfortunately, I didn't, and you will feel guilty again, right? So the consequence of this is, what I want to say is, the basic mode of relating to the world is a mode of aggression. I should do this, I should buy this, I should be able to solve that, I should be able to acquire this skill, and so on. And of course, this mode of aggression can also be reconstructed on a cultural, a social, or a national level, right? You see this mode of aggression in the way we relate to our environment, to nature. We heat it up, we burn up the atmosphere, literally, right? I mean, it's very interesting that the climate crisis, which is very bad, I think it's all over the northern world right now, it's very hot, while Australia, for example, is kind of drowning. So we are really, so there's no doubt about it, right? So we are heating up the atmosphere. And by the way, heating up a gas or an atmosphere means making the molecules go faster, right? Heat is an increase in the speed level of molecules, right? So the difference between a cold air and hot air is that in the hot air, molecules spin faster. It's literally true. So you can really say this logic of dynamic stabilization or acceleration is it's kind of heating up, it's kind of creating acceleration in the atmosphere, right? But of course, aggression towards nature cannot just be seen in the climate crisis, but also in the extractive industries and in all of the pollution problem, right? We are aggressive towards nature, but I believe we are even aggressive in the socio-political realm. There is an interesting project in at the London School of Economics by Michael Bruter, who is studying political cultures. And he says something which people in Brazil know very much. I don't know, maybe it's, I don't know the situation in Portugal, right? But in the United States or in Brazil or in England or in Germany, you see it very clearly that aggression in the political realm has become the dominant mood. And this is for me very interesting, right? I mean, of course, the supporters of Donald Trump would what they would like to do most is kill the liberals, right? But the liberals hate Trump and the Republicans just as much. So they are no longer perceiving of each others as opponents, which you can talk to, but as enemies you would like to almost kill, at least to silence. And I know it's the same in Brazil, where it's now coming probably towards a race between Bolsonaro and Lula, and the supporters of them, they hate each other. They are ready to kill each other, or at least close to, right? And in England, you have it with the Brexit, so those who are in favor of Brexit and the Remainers, right? And in Germany, we had it, for example, with those who were in favor of vaccination against COVID and those who were against it, right? So I believe this stance of aggression has also become a social mode, right? The others are hindrances in our daily race, and we would like to silence them. But it's also, and this, of course, is again very important for conceptions of pedagogy, I think we have turned auto-aggressive, right? And you can see this, there's a lot of empirical data which proves it. And by the way, it proves it with the disastrous effects. I believe we teach the young, and of course also the not so young, right, to become aggressive towards themselves, because we ask them to permanently work on them, right? You should not weigh so much, you should do more steps, you should look differently, but also you should acquire all these skills. And this makes people aggressive towards themselves. I'm not content with my body. There is good social empirical research which says people in our societies, I believe Brazil is a good example for this too, but certainly Germany and others, and the United States and also Portugal, we are no longer content with the way we look. All the time we're dissatisfied. We feel unhappy. I want it to be much nicer, right? I don't like my hair. I don't like my body, and so on. And but it's not just the body. It's of course also our capacities. People are dissatisfied with their psyche. I would want to be more relaxed. I don't want to blush when someone addresses me. I don't want to become nervous when I have to take an exam, and so on, right? So we have turned auto-aggressive. We permanently think we are dissatisfied with ourselves and we want to rework ourselves, right? So my claim is what we really create by this is, I mean, of course, I mean, you can see, I mean, we destroy nature, we destroy democracy, and we destroy ourselves in the form of stressed out and burned out people, right? But my main term for this is alienation, and I like this. So I would really call the banking model of pedagogy, as I understand it, is an alienating model of pedagogy, right? And I think this is what Freire wrote about too. I mean, of course, I mean, he was concerned with what does the system do to people who are oppressed. But in a certain way, I would claim, maybe I'm totally wrong, and please tell me, right? But I would say in a certain way, all subjects, all pupils are oppressed by this model and by this system, because it's not about their relating to the world, creating the world, transforming the world, but it's creating a mode of what I call alienation. And alienation is defined philosophically by Rahel Yegi and others as a relationship, eine beziehungslose Beziehung. It's a relationship without a true inner relationship. So it's a distortion in the mode we relate to the world. We are in the world, we are to the world. And of course, this is, as I understand it, Freire's theme. Carlos has written a lot about this, right? So alienation is a failure to truly appropriate the world, appropriate it not in the way of buying it, but in the way of relating to it. It's a relationship without true relation, in which we feel disconnected from our past and future, disconnected from people, places, things in our own body. And burnout, which has become a cultural obsession in almost, also even in China, right? The Chinese know very much what we talk about here, because they experience the same problem. And I believe burnout or depression is the radical manifestation of alienation, because it means you live in a world which has become dead, silent, bleak, gray, cold for you, right? People in a burnout, they really have this experience. Everything out there is so distant, it's silent, it no longer touches me, it doesn't reach me. But it's the same is true for me. I feel I no longer have the power, the capacity to reach out and make things alive, right? Or to become alive. I'm dead. I don't even feel myself anymore. We know from depression research that people in depression really have a kind of, even their color perception changes. They experience the world as grayed out, as dark and gray. Okay, so basically what we create, right? Subjects which with a lack of meaning, in the sense of affection, that something really grips you, touches you, moves you, but also people who lack the power of self-efficacy. I mean, depression or alienation is when you feel you don't have the power to reach out and transform the world and let yourself be transformed by the world. And that has a lot to do with oppression, of course. So let's now finally turn to my counter model, right? I really started with the question of what's the opposite of alienation? And my answer to this is it's the mode of resonance, right? So when are you not alienated from the world, right? I mean, if you take the example of what we are doing right now, it might well be that someone told you maybe to watch this event and you feel alienated. That means you think, I don't understand what this German sociologist is talking about. I'm not really interested in it. It doesn't speak to me, right? I'm bored and I'm depressed, right? It's kind of meaningless, right? That's a state of alienation. And when does it, so basically you can make a quick test whether you are alienated right now. Whenever you ask yourself, what am I doing here? You're alienated, right? So the question is, why am I doing this, right? That's a kind of, if you don't have a good answer to this, then you're alienated. And when does this change? When all of a sudden you feel that something, it doesn't have to be me, it could be a colleague writing something in the chat, for example, right? Something is speaking to you, something is touching you, right? Or gripping you, right? So for me, resonance is, I mean, I defined alienation as a relationship without a true inner relation. So resonance is a true related relationship, right? The question is, what is a related relationship, a true relationship? And for me, it's resonance, and it has 4 elements. The first is something is speaking to you, something is addressing you. So it's touching you. There you already see that this is important for pedagogy, right? Because if on the banking model, the children or the students don't count at all. They are not really addressed, right? There is just a topic given to them which they have to take in, right? So it's an alienating form of pedagogy. But resonance is when something speaks to you. You feel addressed, you feel meant, you feel seen, you could say, right? But the first element of resonance is something speaks to me. So it could be an idea I hear, right? It could be a face I see, eyes looking at me. But it can also be a wonderful music I hear all of a sudden, and I feel it somehow speaks to me, it touches me, it moves me. Or it could be a wonderful sight I see this bird out there. It's amazing, right? So this can be a first element. I call it affection. Something is breaking the armor of the aggressive mode and is touching me, it's moving me, right? So with Bruno Latour, the French sociologist, you could say you feel called, or you feel called upon by something. But now, but that's not just enough for resonance. The second element, and I think Freire was very aware of this, and this was very important to him. And my second element is, I call it emotion, because it has the opposite direction, right? Affection is something is coming towards me, afficere, adfacere. The second element, but the second moment is reaching out, emovere, emotion. Literally, it means moving outward, right? And you can see it. I mean, if we talk about pedagogy or education, think of a classroom, right? I mean, I know Freire didn't talk about classes or so, but we all know what a classroom is, or a lecture room. And you all, if you're somehow involved in teaching, you really know what it means to talk to people who are alienated, right? So you look at dull faces, at tired faces, or maybe people are on the cell phone or they're falling asleep. Maybe they even look at you in a hostile way, right? But if all of a sudden there is a moment of resonance, you can really see how the eyes change. The eyes are beaming up, even the body posture is changing. That is reaching out, right? It's emotion moving outwards. And this has to be connected with a sense of self-efficacy, right? So when I get in resonance, I'm touched by something, the first element. The second, I answer it, I reach out, I do something with it, but this gives me a sense of self-efficacy. It's not a passive thing, right? It's an active thing. I do something. Or what did you, for example, right? You say something which I find, which resonates. And then I immediately ask, what was that? Does it mean this? Does it mean that? Why? Maybe I have a different opinion, right? Emotion or self-efficacy, the answer can also be a kind of opposition. I don't agree with you. That's totally wrong what you say, right? But that gives me the sense of aliveness and self-efficacy, right? So the basic, so resonance is a movement, right? As Carlos said in the introduction, it comes from physics, right? It's an acoustic thing, right? But I use it as a by the structure of the relationship, right? And it's a dual relationship. Something touches me and I reach out and touch the other thing too. And that creates a kind of a movement in between. And now the interesting thing is that for me, out of this in-betweenness, the new is born. And that, I mean, Freire, in my understanding, was very much concerned with transformation, right? And of course, the German concept of Bildung has this very much in it, right? Bildung has always a transformative effect, but I claim that resonance is even a dual form of transformation, right? Think of a classroom when there is resonance, then subjects, students, let's say, they are really touched, they are involved, they are immersed, moved, but what they work on changes also in their understanding, in the way they handle it, but also in what the object is they deal with, right? So we can create the world anew in moments of resonance. And you know what I find really interesting with Hannah Arendt, when she speaks of natality, the new is born, right? Human beings have the capacity to start anew, or even to bring about the new. And I believe the new is always coming about in moments of resonance, and you cannot say what the locus, the place of resonance is, right? For example, if we have a discussion, I hope we'll have one in a minute, right? If I say what I always say, it's not resonance. If you think what you always think, or you ask or contribute what you always ask or contribute, it's not resonance either. But it might happen that out of our interaction, a new idea is born. And maybe others pick on it and we discuss it and we add some new ideas to it. And then a new idea is created. And in the end, we cannot say it was my idea, or it was your idea, or his idea, or her idea. It was created in the middle, right? Resonance means that the new impulse, agency, I think it has to do with agency, the place of agency, it is shifting from me or you as subjects to the in-between of interaction. That for me is the core of resonance, and I think it also should be the core of pedagogy or education. And you know, we know it if you do biographical research, right? People would actually tell the stories of their lives from moments of resonance, right? They would tell you, I went to this place, I just wanted to buy some, I don't know, a book. And then I met this person, or I heard this music, or I stumbled across this idea or so. And that did something to me. It transformed me. After that concert or lecture or trip or journey or whatever it was, I was a different person, right? So it doesn't always have to have this huge effect, but resonance has this transformative quality. But, and this is very important, and that's the opposite to our dominating banking model of pedagogy, right? You cannot really make it, it's uncontrollable, right? Here I still said unpredictable, but I have written this book, which is translated in most languages as uncontrollability. And that's what I mean. There's a German term, Unverfügbarkeit, which you really cannot translate easily into any, as far as I know, not into Spanish, not into French, not into Italian or English easily. But it means kind of uncontrollability, unpredictability, right? And resonance you cannot bring about, even if you have the best intentions and you go as a teacher, you go to the classroom and you want to create a really great lesson. It might be that there is no resonance. Students are still tired or bored or dull. You talk past each other, right? And the new is not born, right? There is no transformation. It was a boring, dull lecture. But resonance is uncontrollable in two ways, in a double meaning, right? On the one hand is you cannot bring it about, you cannot buy it. Right? You might buy a lecture or a talk by the greatest expert on a certain field of knowledge, and you go there and you listen to it and you feel you are not touched, you are not moved, you don't feel, you lack self-efficacy, right? So you cannot bring it about, you cannot buy it. But if it happens, right? And that's the most interesting thing. You don't know what the outcome is. I really believe education in this sense, or resonance, is essentially open-ended. Yes, it will transform those involved. I mean, for Freire, it has an immensely political aspect, right? And if there's a kind of, if there is how does he call it, a literary a consciousness, so to speak, which is created, then there will the new will be born, so to speak, and no one could say what the result, the outcome of an, let's say, democratic, for example, form of interaction or a dialogue will be, right? But it's even true. I do work with teachers occasionally, and they actually say that, and I know it, of course, myself from when I teach a class, right? If it gets really resonant, it's impossible to say at what point this will happen and what the insights we gain will be, because there is something newborn. I even use the term of the middle voice in English, or mediopassivity, when you study ancient languages, which means it's I would really say true Bildung, true pedagogy is somehow done in the medium state between activity and passivity, right? I mean, passivity would be something is given to me, I learn something and I'm totally passive, and Freire totally disliked that, right? But activity would be if I just do something. But medium passivity is when you can't even tell whether you're receiving or doing, whether you are active or passive. I mean, my favorite example for this is, let's say, students or people, for example, dancing with each other, right? Let's think of a dance, right? You have two persons dancing. Normally, most of the time, you could say one person is leading, is active, the other is led, is passive, right? And then it might change at another occasion. The other person is leading and the other person is led, right? It's the same with in a band, in a musical band, where they're improvising, right? So at one time the guitar will be leading, at the other time it might be the trumpet or whatever it is, right? And the others are following. But when the music or the dance are at the climax, are at their best, people cannot tell whether they are leading or whether they are led, right? It's like in this famous poem by Yeats, who can tell the dancer from the dance, right? Or you can tell the dancer from the dance. It's like with the music, it's as if the locus of agency is in between us. I cannot say whether I'm dominating or dominated, or whether I'm leading or whether I'm led. And this for me is when the ideas of the new is born, and that's the heart of resonance, and maybe the heart of educational politics, at least it could be. Now, I would claim this, I think, is my last slide, so I'm slowly coming to the end. I think the real goal of education should be not be transmitting skills. Let's go away from the banking model. I think I'm totally in agreement with Carlos and Freire and others, right? The goal of education for me is opening up the 4 axes of resonance, what I call 4 axes of resonance, because there is resonance has kind of 4 axes. One is being capable of entering into resonance in the social level. I call it the horizontal axis, right? Getting in contact with other people. Love and friendship are core examples, but even in politics, in dialogue, listening and answering, right? Then I believe there's the axis of materiality, getting in resonance with our surrounding, with nature around us, but also with our works of art, but even with our everyday works, with the tools we work with, right? And I have 2 more axes. One I call the vertical or the existential axis of resonance, being in resonance with what you consider the essence of life or the cosmos or nature. We have different names for it. I believe religion is the idea, or most religious ideas have at their core the idea that we are really in connection with a resonant other, right? Someone hearing us, someone seeing us, someone addressing us, someone speaking to us. And in prayer, for example, or in meditation, we can somehow get in contact with this resonant other. So those are religious ideas of existential resonance, but there are other forms of experiencing art or nature, which give us a sense of existential connection, if you so like. And finally, I believe there's what I call the self-axis of resonance, being in resonance with your body and your psyche and your memory, your biography, right? And your biography, right, is very important. So those are 4 axes of resonance. But no, let's wait a second. But let me go back to education again. You know, I have this strong conviction. What should a school do? I think it should not transmit skills, right, and make people compatible or how do you call this, competitive in the daily race. But it's about opening up axis of resonance towards the domains of life. For example, let's say you have a history lesson, right? So the goal of this history lesson is not coming to know facts or dates or events, but that history speaks to you, that all of a sudden you realize this is addressing me. It is meaningful for me. I can, and also, and this is very important, it gives me self-efficacy. I can kind of react to historical experiences. And this creates an axis of resonance from history to the future. But then you might have a different lesson. Let's say you have a lesson on biology, right? So it's not just about learning about, I don't know, different forms of animals, but it's kind of creating an axis of resonance towards plants and animals, right? Which is very important. Martha Nussbaum includes this in her list of capabilities, right? So biology can open up an axis of resonance towards the nature we live in, right? But then you might have, let's say, physics, a lesson in physics. And then, for example, you can get the stars and the galaxies, right, to resonate with you. It's where our life comes from and so on. And it's even more true if you have a literature class, right? You know, experiencing that poems speak to you, they address you, they can be a source of resonance. And the same is true for music or for sports or for politics. And you can really see those who are successful later in life. I think what's our present day schools do in Germany, for example, it's very bad, but it's certainly the same in the United States. They open up axis of resonance for the elites, right? For the higher middle, or at least for the, let's say, for the middle classes, right? If a successful middle class kids leave schools, then for her, really those axis of resonance vibrate. She loves music, biology, physics, and so on, right? And she knows she's interested in politics. It's speaking to her, so she becomes a self-efficacious, active member of society. While the underclass boy, let's say, right, for him, the school has been turned into a sphere of alienation. then he would go out and say, oh, I'm not interested in history. Oh, politics is boring. It has nothing to do with me. That's why they don't vote anymore. It's not an axis of resonance, right? I'm not interested. Mathematics is nothing for me. And you know, the way it's done, the way alienation of this sort is created, it's by destroying self-efficacy, the sense of being capable of getting the world to answer. Okay. So my last two sentences, it's very important because, you know, as you know, I'm advocating this model of resonance, and a lot of people misunderstand it, I would claim, and they think it's about harmony and unity. I was in Latin America, in Chile, for example, and a lot of people who are quite sympathetic to what I do, they dislike the concept of resonance because they say in Chile, for example, we cannot go for harmony. We have to fight. We have to win a struggle, right? It's about oppression. But for me, it's very important that resonance is not harmony or unity, right? It's a self-efficacious connection, which gives the power for transformation and the power for what I call self-efficacy, right? Answering and doing something. So when we argue, for example, we argue about, is it resonance or is it the pedagogy of the oppressed? We might even shout at each other, right? And I would say, no, you're wrong, but it's still resonance. I'm listening, I'm answering, I'm trying to convince you, when we are trying to transform our thinking. So resonance is not harmony. I call it the mere harmony. We all are one. That I call an empty echo, right? So an echo, listening to the same, just amplifying a given identity, is not resonance. Resonance is transforming our identity through encountering another person or another idea. And of course, that was important for Freire too, right? And at times we have a right to refuse resonance in order to find our own voice, right? We have to resonate with ourselves. If I resonate with the things coming towards me all the time, I will not become a resonant being. Sometimes I have to, you know, in the age of puberty, when boys or girls are 14 or so, 13, 14, they certainly need to refuse resonance for some periods of time in order to find their own voices, right? What is it that speaks to me in schools or beyond schools and so on? All right, so but I'm quite hopeful that we can create a resonant world, because resonance is not something we have to be taught. Right? This is very important for me. Resonance is not something we have to learn at schools, because even very young children, even sucklings, right, when they have no language, no reason, they are geared for resonance. They need resonance. They need to be held and caressed, but they realize that with their eyes and with their voice, they can make contact. It's through the eyes of the mother or the significant other that they get a sense of themselves. So from day one, we are resonant beings. And once you're very old and suffer from dementia, you're still resonant. You're perceptible to touch. You recognize music, right? So resonance is our primordial way of being in the world and being to the world. And we don't have to learn it, but we might dislearn it if we are given to the wrong models of pedagogy, for example, the banking model of pedagogy. Thank you very much for your patience and for your resonance.
Thank you very much, Professor Hartmut Rosa. My impression is that you have synthesized two of the most important books some of us have read in the last 10 years in an hour, and given us the foundations to begin to talk about it. And since we are doing explorations between pedagogy of resonance, which now exists as a formal set of arguments following your premises, and then the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is a bit longer history, I think the resonance and the pedagogy of the oppressed need to be inspected. So what I'd like to do now in the next few minutes is to bring some concepts into attention and ask you 6 questions, which will help to synthesize a little bit of what you have said, but also we'll put at the end in the last question, which has to do with one question of how Freire created the epistemology of the Global South, will also be a question towards resonance. But let me say just at the very beginning that one of the things that I have been impacted by the work of Freire is how it resonated in the context of the 1960s and beyond, and created a language that people wanted to approach, because that language gave them ways to speak about reality that apparently didn't happen before. So Freire is not just an adult educator. It's not just somebody who has made changes in terms, for instance, in healthcare, in the terms of the patient doctor relationship and the question of an epistemology of relations beyond just an epistemology of power. All those elements made Freire such a myth in his own lifetime. Now, I will say that Freire offers in his meta-language, in his poetics, and the epistemology of curiosity and the epistemology of suspicion, the suspicion that all social relationships involve a moment of domination, a set of insights which I compare to Antonio Gramsci in Quaderni di Carcere, in which a great deal of these insights need to be analyzed and very carefully studied. I think a lot of the insights that you presented today need to be carefully studied. Some of my own students and I have spent a whole year discussing your book on resonance. Now, let me offer 5 quick hypotheses to situate my questions, and then 6 questions. The first hypothesis is that from the perspective of my own analysis over the years, Freire followed the insights of the first generation of critical theory a la Frankfurt, that is particularly Marcuse and Erich Fromm. And also simultaneously, I will argue that Freire is a representative of the Enlightenment. This is a convoluted argument because many people consider the Enlightenment pure Eurocentrism and therefore attacking the basic premises of a model of post-colonialism. But I will say there is nothing wrong to look at these two traditions together, being a representative of critical theory from a Frankfurt tradition, but also a representative of the Enlightenment. And I will also argue, following Freire in his reading of Marcuse, a representative of negative philosophy, which is a fascinating concept that I enjoy reading the translation of Marcuse's dissertation, which was translated in the 1950s in Latin America. So the first hypothesis is this connection between Freire and critical theory. The second hypothesis, in the same tradition, Freire is concerned with developing a model of Bildung, which refers to a process of self-education, even emancipation, and therefore the concern of Freire for self-awareness and political awareness. That is a second hypothesis from which I will elaborate a question. The third hypothesis is that many people think that Freire is an utopian thinker. And there are some elements in Freire himself that I identified this notion of utopia when he talks about the concept of inédito viable, which means a concept that speaks about something that has not been realized, but is possible, which in essential is a definition of utopia. Then my fourth hypothesis is that Freire has taken the notion of critical with different implications, which I think is what the 4 great traditions of critical theory in Frankfurt School are indicating to us. And some will argue, and I agree, that Professor Rosa is one of the creators of this new perception, this new model of critical theory in the 4th generation. And the 5th hypothesis is that Freire was one of the first intellectuals of looking at the global South as opposing the global North and advancing the epistemology of the global South, and particularly a post-colonial approach. This is very clear in the first writings of Freire in the 50s, but even more clear in chapter 3 of Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So here is my first question. And if Professor Harmut agree, I will make the question and maybe you would like to answer because we are trying to synthesize argument. You prefer that or you prefer me to outline all the 6 questions?
I think we can go one by one, right?
Yes. So the first question is, how does resonance as a sociology of our relationship to the world relate to the legacy of critical theory at the Frankfurt School?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think it relates almost directly to it in maybe in two ways. I mean, on the one, you know, I did my dissertation with Axel Honneth, right? Of course, who is a 4th generation, so to speak, a critical theory, but he was also close with Habermas, of course. And I somehow, so I learned a lot, but I wrote on Charles Taylor's political philosophy. But I somehow, you know, for me, I thought, I really wanted to go back to the older conceptions, like particularly to the concept of alienation, because for me, Habermas and Honneth have become a bit too affirmative of modernity in total, right? I mean, in my reading for Habermas and Honneth, the modernity is going in the right direction. It just has a few flaws, so to speak. And I think that's very different from what Marcuse or Adorno and Fromm and others said from the 1st generation, right? Because for them, something was wrong at an existential level on a very basic mode of our mode of being in the world, particularly, of course, you can see it with Marcuse and I would say from Marcuse, Adorno, you see it most clearly, but also with Benjamin and his, Walter Benjamin and his very pessimism of progress. And so I thought I didn't want to just focus on justice, even though justice is very important, but I thought that the world is so unjust that we still have oppression in a huge extent and that it could even have come to the colonization project, right? Something is wrong at the very basic level, and I wanted to get at this, right? And I wanted to create that with a sense of alienation or with the notion of alienation, but alienation has been dropped almost completely in later days critical theory until I think let's say Rahel and myself actually came up again with a notion or worked on it. So I wanted to pick up this concept and get to the deeper level, right? For me, maybe like in Freire's epistemology of suspicion, right? It's a critique of modernity as in totality, right? But then the problem with the 1st generation critical theory is that it was very hard to see what a non-alienated form of existence could be, right? I mean, if you think of Adorno, he was very negative, right? But he had this kind of a mimetic way of being in the world or to the world. And of course, with Marcuse in Eros and Civilization, which I like a lot, he would actually say that the opposite of the Promethean stance of aggressive society, if you so like, of the banking model, the opposite is an erotic way of being in the world, but eros not just understood in a sexual or a sense, right? But in a form of relating to the world. And then Walter Benjamin has the notion of aura, and Fromm has the notion of spontaneity, but none of them has really worked it out into a coherent conception. And my conviction was that if we want to overcome modernity, or let's say the problematic dimensions of modernity, we need to have a kind of positive vision. So Resonance really wanted to spell out, give us an idea of where we would want to go to, because I thought that to be purely negativistic or negative like Adorno and Horkheimer, right, does not muster the motivational energy to really overcome the problem. And this is the sense in which I try to connect to the critical theory school.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask the next question, and then I have to struggle so my battery doesn't die. So
yeah, okay.
I give you the question, and I will have to
yes.
plug my computer.
Yes.
The next question is about Bildung, which is a concept in German, and a concept that has multiple definitions, but I think the most important one is the question of learning as a process of self-exploration. And Freire was always talking about humanization. How Bildung is considered important in your own construction of this possible pedagogy of anti, or put it differently, in the way in which you address answers to alienation through a pedagogy of resonance?
Yes, I mean, I think so. It's the question how my concept relates to Freire's concept, right?
No, how it relates to the tradition of discussion of Bildung.
Of Bildung generally,
Because
yeah.
Freire relates in a particular way.
Yes, okay. Yeah, I mean, with the Bildung tradition, it's very interesting because I did not develop my concept of resonance I did not even do it in the first place with an interest to pedagogy, right? I really, I came this way. I had written social acceleration, and then people thought that I was just criticizing speed in total. I was arguing for slowness. I was called the guru of deceleration or the guru of slowness. And I never advocated slowness. I don't think, on the one hand, I don't think it's possible to simply slow down. And on the other hand, I don't even think it's a good thing. A slow fire engine is not better than a fast one. And a slow internet connection is not better than a fast one. So I picked up the concept of alienation, and I said, acceleration is only problematic when it leads to alienation. But then I needed the opposite of alienation. What is a non-alienated form of being in the world? And then my answer was resonance, right? A resonant mode of being in the world. So I started to write the book, and actually education and pedagogy was only one chapter in a huge book, or in a thick book, as you probably know. But then I realized by discussing and by starting to really get into the topic, how close it was to the concept of Bildung, because Bildung in the tradition of Herder or Humboldt or many others, right? Is this idea of being transformed in this dual sense. And I really understand this as the essence of Bildung, right? It's an encounter, a transformative encounter between self and world, right? Where you, it's not just a passive imprint, but it's not just an active doing either, but it's this. It's what I try to say with the resonance for me. And Bildung always, of course, had this transformative aspect, right? It transforms the subject, but it also transforms the world, and therefore it is always in essence also political, right? So I was fascinated by basically finding out that the concept of resonance is close to the Bildungs tradition, actually much closer than I thought in the beginning. So I tried to spell that out more specifically. But of course, also our older concepts of Bildung have the problem that they are very much in the German, in the not just rooted in German idealism, but also in the bourgeois society, right? It did not really have a sense of, at least for a long time, of those in the working classes or the oppressed. Or those colonized. So I think Bildung has to be reformulated in our modern present day world, and there has to be not just that we have to become sensitive to the different contexts and also to the different obstacles to education, right? Or to Bildung in this sense, but also that there is a different challenge to Bildung and also different transformative possibilities in different sections of the population and of the world. And I think Freire has done a lot to point out these things.
That's very clear. Thank you very much. My next question has to do with utopia, because many people dismiss the concept of utopia, but great intellectuals like Eric Olin Wright, who passed away a couple of years ago, spent the last 20 years of his life looking at possible real utopias. And what motivated his work was to see the end of the Cold War, 1989, and how that affected that transition. And he was an analytical Marxist, and his question was how we can change capitalism. So real utopias has been very important in the conversation. There are other people who have been talking about that. Piketty criticizing the regimes of inequality, etc. So the question to you is very simple. do you think that theory of resonance, a pedagogy of resonance, could be considered utopia?
Yeah, I mean, as you already kind of suggested, right? Utopia or utopianism is a very diverse concept. I mean, of course, I mean it's in a certain sense. I wouldn't actually call it utopian, right? But of course, it's pointing to a way of being in the world, to a mode of being in the world, which is very different from the existing mode. So in that sense, it's kind of utopian, right? It's kind of, you know, I always want to make it really speaking to the, or being relevant to the basic mode of relating to the world. So if you claim, as I do, that our current way is an aggressive mode and I'm looking for a different mode, it's kind of utopian, right? I'm dreaming of a different world. You could clearly make that point. So you could say it's utopian, but on the other hand, right, there are two qualifications. On the one hand, it's not utopian in the sense that it spells out what the world should look like in the future. It's not a substantive utopia, it's a relational utopia, right? It's a different form of relationships, but it's non-utopian, it's very realistic in the sense that I think resonance per se is not something utopian, right? As human beings, we are resonant beings. As I always say, children really are resonant beings, particularly children, right? Because I mean, you can see it in all they do. And it's really true. I mean, we know that all over the world, normally pupils and students like to go to school. Right, and so you see, for me, it's a kind of natural thing. They want to be addressed, and you can see it. What I described, eyes beaming up by this experience. There is something speaking to me, and I can self-efficaciously answer it, and I experience this transformation. It's a deep desire in children, right? The yearning, being touched and transformed, and it's not just in children. And that's why, I mean, as you said and wrote, Freire was very much concerned with pedagogy for the adults, for the grown-ups, right? I mean, this yearning for resonance, but also this capacity for resonance is a lifelong capacity, right? And of course, in conditions of oppression, you might lose it, right? I mean, you know, look, I mean, there are two ways how you can kind of kill, or at least severely damage, maybe not kill, but severely damage the capacity for resonance. One is really violence, and there's a lot of violence in the world, right? And traumatization, because if you make the experience that being touched is being hurt, right? Then you don't want yourself to be touched. You don't let yourself be touched by someone or something you cannot control. And you don't want to enter into a process which transforms you in an uncontrollable way, right? So traumatizing someone, right, oppressing or inflicting violence is a very good way of kind of making him or her almost incapable, or at least unwilling, to enter into this open form of resonance. Entering into a process of resonance means making yourself vulnerable. And there are a lot of social conditions in which it doesn't make sense to allow yourself or to make yourself vulnerable. But there is a second way of killing our capacity of entering into relationships of resonance, and that is killing the other sense of self-efficacy. And in my reading, Freire was concerned with that a lot when he writes about people in rural conditions, or also in slums, which completely depend on and rely on and trust in their masters, so to speak, or their owners or whatever, right? Because they lack their sense of self-efficacy, right? I mean, it's not me who can do anything, it's the other person. So if you, and the schools do this, right? If you convince the students that he is incapable of doing mathematics, he or she will never have an experience of resonance in mathematics or any other subject. So as I say, it's not utopian in the sense that we already have this capacity for resonance, but it's possible to kind of to make it to almost kill it, or at least to severely damage it.
Thank you very much. The next question will be about the sense of critique that is embedded in a pedagogy of resonance. In Freire, there is almost a nominal argument of attention between the oppressor and the oppressed. And some people have criticized that as a binomial model in which you don't have anything in between. But in fact, Freire is a little bit more complex than that, because it's almost a psychoanalytical definition of how the oppressor could become oppressed and vice versa. So that's the reason. So some people have even talked about different models of pedagogy for those who are privileged, the pedagogy of privilege and things like that. But my question to you is, if you're going to follow Freire's argument to the extreme, and that context in the 60s was a class analysis, but then it became much more complex because he was learning more in discussions with people outside Latin America, etc., and becomes more on race, on gender, on inequality in general, but not only class inequality. And at the end of his life, with eco-pedagogy, he was very concerned about the environment. So here is this question: what part of resonance pedagogy particularly focus on critique?
Yeah, I mean, the pedagogy of resonance, as I understand it, is per se not a critique. I mean, it's not. I mean, the idea of what pedagogy or education or Bildung could be, right, is not in itself a critique of an existing society. But the idea is that it makes people capable not just of criticizing, but even of transforming situations and situations of oppression, but also even societies, right? So I think, I mean, for me, the critical thing is that, you could say the critical core. There is a critical core, which means that resonance is never, what I said at the beginning, it's never harmony. It needs this sense of dissonance of an other against which I also struggle, right? It's the dynamics is kind of created or gained out of a critical tension, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be between oppressor and oppressed. I would not want to make, as you, I think, suggested also, to make this distinction too clear cut, because I think, I think it's a kind of, if you don't grant the question is, what is an oppressor? Of course, if he is an oppressor as a person, it might get very difficult. But when you think of it in class terms, right, for example, right, I think to simply deny someone the capacity to enter into a resonant relationship with you because he is of the dominant classes is a kind of negative classism, right? It would really mean that this other person is not capable of resonance. And this, I think, is kind of wrong too, right? I have this trust in the people's capacity to enter into resonant relationships. But of course, we have to be very aware of power relations there, right? Of power relations which might not even be in the consciousness of the oppressing class, right? Or the dominant fractions. So I think this is actually a task which I have to work on more clearly, because people like Freire and others they know more about it and they have worked more about it. So I think critical is, I would hope what pedagogy of resonance can do is install the idea of to create critical subjects, right? Subjects which never take an idea or whatever it is just at face value or as it is, but which always have this sense of efficaciously going about it. I call it also, I distinguish between two forms of appropriation. One form is simply accepting it and taking it in. So now I know it. Now I can do it, right? So I think that's a non-critical form of pedagogy. But for me, this is not even education, right? Education is transforming it in a sense that you answer with your own voice. And this also includes autonomy. It has to be my voice. And it might well be that my voice is not articulated and not hearable in the first place. So the pedagogy of resonance, like the pedagogy of the oppressed, as I understand it, in the first place needs to focus on making voices heard, right? I mean, making people aware of their own voice, right? So I think it is very one step, and I think Freire has worked a lot on this, is making people aware, critical consciousness, right, of that they do have a voice, that they do have self-efficacy, that they do have the power to transform society, and that they need to create it and gain it, and sometimes also to politically fight for it.
Thank you very much. And that connects with the fifth question, which is central for any conversation about pedagogy of any kind, because it has to be with social transformation. And one of the concepts that emerged very clearly in Freire was praxis. In a way, the idea of understanding the world is to transform the world. And you cannot just simply understand like a voyeur, but essentially to look at how you look at that world that in a way you are also representing. And this is the phenomenological part that I think the two theories really reconcile very well. The question of a phenomenology of the world in many different ways. Praxis emerged as almost a non sequitur. So what would you say that is the essence, or wrong term, is the critical aspect of a theory of resonance in terms of praxis?
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right that what I really do is I combine phenomenology with critical theory, right? Because of course I learned a lot from people like Merleau-Ponty and others, right? That phenomenological aspects, experiences come first, and there seems to be a gap between experience and praxis. But but my hope is that with this notion of what I call, or it's not my notion, right? But I try to use it, of a medio-passive form of praxis, or of a third voice, right? This I really I hope to be the point, or the bridge between experience and praxis, right? Because medio-passivity, or the third voice, means acting together in a way that, you know, giving us a sense of agency, but agency not being in the subjects, but being in a community. The locus of agency is the in-between, but it doesn't mean that the subject is subordinated to the community or the group, right? But it means that everyone is actively and passively involved in this process. And I even want to extend this model to the other aspects of practice, namely practice is always, there's something we act on or about, right? Or there's a kind of subject matter. And my idea is that resonance even is a kind of practically engaging with other people and with some substance in this kind of third voice mode of interacting. So it's so resonance, you know, I mean, that's the one aspect I want to go, or to bridge, create a bridge between phenomenology and praxis. On the other hand, I would say there is always a kind of, I mean, certainly the idea of resonance is never just about learning something, having a cognitive representation of something. Because of the phenomenology in it, right? Resonance is always the idea you feel called by something, right? And if you feel called by something, it always kind of, it requires an active response, that you enter into practice. I would really say there is no Bildung if it doesn't have consequences in your practices and in your actions. You feel called by something, you react to it, you become a different person, right? And then it's kind of action, it's practice in which resonance is lived and done and acted. So I really hope that this idea of resonance can be made useful for context of practice as well.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. The last question is a question that is very important in Latin America now. I just came from Canada as well. This is a question of post-colonial strategies of decolonization, of learning and praxis. Just to situate this conversation, probably some people know that there are a large number of indigenous people in Canada who were dispossessed of their land and even their honor and even their own dignity. And during a long period of time, the children were taken away and put it in schools run by the Catholic Church. And now the Pope is in Canada apologizing for that tragedy, because in a way, about 1.6, 1.7 million of indigenous people, the three categories are the First Nation, the the Inuit and the Métis, all of them feel that they have been violated. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation brought that subject into the foreground, and now there are been investments in billions of dollars in Canada to try to repair those situations. Just with that little preface, I will also put a question that I was presented in Canada, and it was difficult for me to answer, which is the following. The First Nation people requires autonomy. They want autonomy. They want to be themselves with their traditions, with their epistemology, with the way of related to nature, etc. Why do they have to trust liberal democracy? And how you deal with that tension between liberal democracy and this tradition that has been affected so deeply by modernity? When I was posed with that question, I did not know how to answer it. So I said, well, from a Freudian perspective, the first thing that we do is to recognize the other. The recognition of the other is the beginning of a dialogue. And in the recognition of the other, we should figure out why they are so forcefully trying to create this model of post-coloniality. So then I could not answer more than that. Then I thought again, and I said, wait a second, there is another element here. The interlocutor. You better have conversations and negotiations with people who truly believe in liberal democracy than from authoritarian populists that will try to run over you and all your principles. So in a way, I began to create a political concept of a dialogue between the traditions of post-colonialism and the traditions of liberal democracy. So here is the question for your analysis. Is people will say to you, what is the post-colonial contribution of your analysis? What would you say?
I would say that I find this a really important topic, and I know that what I've written so far is kind of gradually moving away from really just Western, and therefore you could say colonial or post-colonial thinking, right? Because of course, at first I always said I want to understand that this dominant mode of being in the world of operation, social acceleration, which I think I still claim that it's affecting most people all over the world in different forms, right? But now I think with this, now I really want to overcome this idea of not this idea, I mean the ethnocentric elements in the theory of resonance and in the theory of social acceleration too. And I really hope that, for example, with notions like resonance, but also mediopassivity or the third voice, there is a way. And you know, now I want to write on social energy. I really have to make this point briefly. I realized that in Western sociology, let's say, right, or in social sciences, we don't have any concept of energy apart from physical energy, carbon-based or solar-based, or so energy, physical energy or chemical energy or so on. But what is the social energy? The energy you see in a social movement, political energy, right? Even individual energy. I mean, if you talk about, you know, one day I would say I'm so full of energy. What does that mean? I mean, even psychologists can't really tell. I mean, they would have to go to Freud when he talks about drive theory, but people don't talk about drive theory anymore. So sometimes psychologists speak of motivational energy, but it's not clearly defined. And the worst thing about it, it's always individual. But I think following Randall Collins is about the only sociologist who has really written about it, right? He talks about emotional energy, and he realizes that energy is not simply my energy. It comes out of interaction, right? Out of processes. And what I find interesting is that almost, I think, all cultures I have read of, different forms of living, right, do have conceptions of energy. Even the Greeks with dynamis or energeia and so on, right? And certainly the Chinese and the Indians and people in Latin America and even in Africa, or also in Africa, They have conceptions of energy, life energy, élan vital. Bergson had something like this, right? So my idea is, by looking at these conceptions, what is actually going on between people and between us and nature, we can overcome the simple limitations, which certainly still are in my own thinking. And when it comes to the conception of resonance, I find it very interesting too. I presented to you 4 axes of resonance, where I said it's the social axis or horizontal, then the diagonal with things, then the existential with what Jaspers calls the encompassing reality, and the self axis of resonance. But we know that in what you talked about, in what we call indigenous, or whatever the right term is, First Nations, right, other pre-capitalist forms of life, they had different axes of resonance, right? Because for them, you could not simply make a distinction between the social world and the world of artifacts, right, or the world of plants and animals. And even for example, there could be some, even in Renaissance thinking, the idea was that within me, I find other beings, right? So I really believe other non-European based cultures, right, forms of life, have very different senses and practices of resonance. They have different axes of resonance. And I think the dominant, the oppressive capitalist form of life should really kind of, we can learn a lot, and not just learn in the sense of appropriation, but in the sense of overcoming our aggressive mode of life by getting in a dialogue with these other senses of axis of resonance, right? For example, when it comes to nature and other things. But I think you hinted at it, that there are also forms of oppression which are not simply capitalist. So I think what my theory of resonance wants to do is aiming at a critique of the conditions of resonance. For example, Habermas, if you are a Marxist, then you write a critique of the conditions of production, right? If you are a Habermasian, you write a critique of the conditions of communication. If you are inspired by Axel Honneth, you write a critique of the conditions of recognition. What I want to do is a critique of the conditions of resonance. And there you see the many forms in which Western colonization, right, and imperialism and capitalism have kind of killed or hampered or hindered or destroyed the conditions of resonance for many other people. But it doesn't simply mean being nostalgic for other or pre-modern forms of life, because in pre-modern forms of life, or however you call it, non-modern forms of life, right, there are other reasons sometimes why the conditions of resonance deserve critique, right? Because there is racist or sexist elements, for example, there is no gender equality, or there's oppression of minorities, sexual minorities, for example, for different reasons. So I believe this idea of a critique of the conditions of resonance can be applied, I hope, in all contexts and circumstances, and can be used as a tool to fight oppressions of all sorts.
Thank you very much. That was a very significant response. We resonate a great deal with the conversation of these so-called pre-capitalist forms and the nature as they have understood it. All right, at this moment, we have a few more minutes left. I will first thank Hartmut for his disposition and brilliance, which has demonstrated one more time, and ask Ines if she could take control of the last part of the conversation, getting questions from the audience. We have another 10, 15, 20 minutes. Is that possible, Ines?
Sure. Thank you very much, Professor Carlos. Thank you very much, Professor Hartmut. It was an incredible seminar. It's been an incredible seminar. So for the participants that we have here, may you want to direct any question, please tell me. I will begin by saying that we have here some comments and we have just received from Jin Yupeng. Thank you so much. I was resonating the whole time and making connections to what I know nonstop. And Mingzelin, as a pre-service ESL primary teacher, could I interpret the pedagogy of resonance as an interactive classroom where students can fully engage in?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think as a pre-service ESL, what primary teacher, okay, yeah. Yes, I mean,
ESL should be English as a second language, I think. So
English,
plural linguistic.
second language. Yeah. I think you can interpret it and understand it and interpret it that way. But I think, it's very interesting that resonance, creating an atmosphere of resonance does not necessarily mean that teachers have to become, there's a lot of discussion that teachers should only be mediators or so, and students should do all by themselves. This is actually not what I would suggest. I think really creating, you're absolutely right that the classroom should become a sphere of resonance, right? Which means really the voices of students are heard, right? And they come alive, so to speak. But sometimes there is a very interesting image, right, or model for this. We can think of education or Bildung or pedagogy as the teacher being a tuning fork in two senses. A tuning fork, when it's when you create a sound of a certain frequency, right? It's a receptive instrument, so to speak. And the idea is that you have to be a kind of a second tuning fork, which means you have to listen to the problems, to the voices, to the moods, to the beings of your students, to really listen, right? To look them in the eye and to let yourself be touched by what the student wants to say and what he or she needs, right? But you can also, at other times, you are the first tuning fork. You inspire them. You can present a new idea to them. So it's like, on the one hand, you kind of, if you're the second, if you're the first tuning fork, you somehow make your own tuning fork sound, and that means you inspire them, you show them what inspires you, what you get in resonance with, and then they might be interested in what you try to teach them in English or in something about England, right? So a teacher permanently has to shift between being the first tuning fork, making people come alive, but also being the second tuning fork, listening to what comes from them. And then, of course, they should also have the capacity to get in resonance with each other. Yes.
Thank you. So we have another written question, but also two people with raised hands. Can we gather all the questions and then maybe, okay? Let me just please briefly say some words in Portuguese so that I can... Se houver aqui colegas que queiram colocar as questões muito brevemente e se possível por escrito em português, eu poderei traduzi-las, se pretenderem. So the written question is by Lee Ian. Thank you for brilliant presentation. I have a question. Pedagogy of resonance is a mean or an end? If it is a mean, is it for emancipation or humanization or something like that? And I would ask Ying to talk, and then Carmela Garcia, and we also have Sonia Cardoso. So we'd gather these three spoken questions, and then I would give you the word again. So please, Ying, can you talk, please?
Me to talk?
Yes.
Oh, sorry about that. I thought I wasn't muted. Thank you, Rosa, for your presentation. So my question is like, because my research is also about utopia. I think when I'm listening to your presentation, Pedagogy of Resonance, so my question is like, to start your video. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I'm on sleep and I'm very impassioned. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so because it's 3 a.m. in Los Angeles.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So my question is like, pedagogy of resonance is a mean for something, or is an end for your result for your presentation. If it is a mean, is it for emancipation or humanization or something like that?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So please, Ying or Jing, I'm not sure how it should be pronounced. Can you talk? You were the first one to raise your hand. I'm not listening. I'm not sure if... So in the meanwhile, not to lose any more time.
Maybe you can write it if
Yes, yes. If you could write, it would be great. Carmela, can you proceed? Carmela Garcia.
Hi, hello. Thank you, Dr. Harmut, for your presentation. It was very insightful. It's difficult to summarize 3 books in an hour.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, first of all, if there are other forms. I mean, you said before, it's very much related to the 6th question Dr. Carlos asked, but there are other forms of oppression that are not only capitalism, and we agree on that. My question is, when talking about social acceleration, just for me to understand the concept of social acceleration, does it apply to the third world, not only by its consequences? I understand that in terms of consequences, of course it applies, but does it apply into a different, there's another dimension that I may not be looking at, that you have in terms of it is being felt. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sonia, can you pose your question, and then I will have 3 written questions. So maybe we wrap these 3 and then we proceed to the others, okay?
Okay.
First of all, I would like to thank you, the very, very interesting talk that you presented us today. I was not really aware of this theory. I'm new at the university, and I also come from sociology, but I am in a research field of higher education policies, which combines very inputs from several sciences and disciplines, and this impedes some specialization sometimes in some of the theories. And as you were talking, I was wondering, because my interest is higher education as a object of study, and specifically doctoral education, which have been under considerable transformation and pressure in the last decades, especially the 2 last ones. And I was wondering, how can we decelerate what is happening in doctoral education? For on the one side, new researchers are being asked to produce fruitful research, meaningful knowledge, innovative one, but increasingly they are being asked to do that in a very pressing environment. Shorter duration for their studies, the pressure to publish, and everything that is also affecting higher education in general. So I was wondering if this theory could help bring higher education and doctoral education in specific, some highlights or some insights about how to become less accelerated and more resonant. Thank you so much.
So I try to answer these 3.
Yes, and then we proceed to the others. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much. 3 really interesting and important questions. I'm not sure whether I have good answers. I mean, the first question is quite interesting. Is it a means or is it an end? That's interesting. That's really interesting. I would say I would really think it's both, right? I mean, for me, resonance really is for me, it really is the ultimate normative yardstick, right? I mean, I always get in trouble and in discussions with philosophers because I sometimes claim I think it should be the only normative criterion we have, right? Because even if it, for example, if we criticize something as unjust, I think why is injustice bad? Because it's kind of denying resonance to someone, right? But okay. So particularly when I think of it in education, I would say it certainly is an end in itself. I really believe that being alive means being in resonance, right? So I would really say the quality of life, that was my intention when I wrote the book, come up with an idea of how could we define the quality of life if we don't simply measure it in terms of income and capacities. I'm even a bit skeptical of Sen and Nussbaum, who simply measure it not in terms of income or so, but or not just in possessions. We have the quality of water and the quality of air and the housing and so on. That's all resources and or the capabilities. What can I do? What is the horizon of what I can do? I think this for me was a wrong yardstick for the quality of life. So I wanted to say the quality of life can be measured in the quality of relationships, and there's a high quality of life if you are, or you do have a good life when you are in resonance with the world along those 4 axes. So certainly resonance is an end in itself. But of course, when we think of it in terms of education, then opening up the capacity for resonance and creating a sphere of resonance is also a means towards transforming society, right? I mean, making society more resonant and also and thereby kind of reducing oppression and injustice and so on. So certainly it's so what is the end then? You could say the end is emancipation. Emancipation for me is important in the sense that you cannot be a resonant subject, you cannot have resonance if you don't have your own voice, if you're not allowed to speak your own voice, if you either never discuss. I mean, think of the oppression of women, right? For in many contexts, they weren't allowed to develop their own voice, so to speak, right? Their own, to discover their axis of resonance and then to live according to it. So certainly there's an element of resonance. And there's also, I'm not sure whether we should call it humanism, but the idea of creating a resonant world is for me the ultimate goal, and that has a lot of affinities to emancipation or and humanization, you could call it, right? So thanks for the question. The answer would be it's both. It's a means and an end. Acceleration in the third world, or I don't know what the correct term is, right? I think there are some studies on it. I mean, the question is really, what do you mean by third world? I mean, it's obvious that even in way beyond Europe, in India, in China, in Brazil, in South Africa, and so on, these mechanisms of dynamic stabilization can be seen in operation too. They kind of define the conditions of living for many people, which are not just middle class, right? So normally my claim is that everyone is kind of affected in this logic of dynamic stabilization, but in different ways, right? So for example, one way is that you're kind of, what I already said, you're pushed out of the logic of dynamic stabilization, and then you are left behind, then the lag gets worse and worse. But of course, I think what we see in some forms of oppression is where people really are just used they are kind of used and abused in the logic of accumulation. So they are included, but they don't. But actually, then they themselves also experience these forms of acceleration. So I think they are not the agents of acceleration, but you can be just the victim of a process of acceleration. When it comes to the middle classes, they are always both agents and victims of acceleration, right? And even the upper classes, I think they are just successful because they play the acceleration game very well. But even they can't stop it, right? So I believe we do see the logic of acceleration almost everywhere, except for a few tiny places, maybe in the Amazons or in Indonesia. There are a few islands where you really see forms of life which simply have not been touched by this logic of dynamic stabilization, but they're always under constant pressure of erosion from outside, from the accelerating world. I think I don't know whether I have anything more to say on this. Yeah, sorry. On the thing with doctoral education, that's very interesting, because that's very interesting. I have a lot to do with it too, because the Max Weber colleague Carlos told you about in the beginning is also a doctoral school, and I do have a lot of doctoral students, and I noticed something a bit strange. I totally agree with you. This, what I described, this logic of acceleration and dynamic stabilization, or the exploding to-do list, is something they experience and suffer from very hardly. But my sense now is that the problem probably is different from what we thought. Because, you know, when I did my doctoral dissertation, it was kind of the norm that you got 2 years funding and then you could apply for a third year, and sometimes you got it and sometimes you didn't. And of course, we always said it's not enough time. We need more than 2 years to write the dissertation. Then it was extended to 3 years. But the situation stayed exactly the same. Now you get 3 years funding and you can apply for a 4th year. And people say it's not enough. We need at least 4 years. And now I'm absolutely sure even if you make it 4 years, the situation will stay exactly the same. So there's a psychological problem there, right? And there is obviously there is a psychological problem in this. I wanted to make the point that you think of the master thesis. A master thesis, at least in Germany, takes half a year to write. So I say, well, if you get 3 years for a doctoral thesis, it's 6 times a master's thesis. And it certainly should not be more. To claim that they should have more time is not sensible, right? So the question is, why do they feel so pressed? Because they clearly suffer, right? I mean, there are clear problems with it, not just with doctoral students, but also with master students. And I think they suffer from the pressing situation of the exploding to-do list. They are expected to read this and this, to write that and that, to go to conferences, but also the feeling, you know, they are exposed to the logic of Snapchat and Instagram in their private lives, right? So the total environment of their lives, I feel, is inimical to writing the dissertation, right? It's not that we ask them to write the dissertation at a pace which is too fast. If it was just the dissertation, they would have ample time and good possibilities to write it. But obviously it's the context we create which makes it kind of psychologically almost impossible for them to really sit down and write it. So I think the best thing I can say is I think we have to rethink the conditions, right? We cannot simply decelerate it in the sense of allowing them or giving them more time to write. We somehow have to, first of all, raise awareness of it, and then somehow think of how can we, I mean, obviously in the end, we would still have to reduce the to-do list, but that the to-do list is so full, it's not just coming from academia, it's coming from the outside world to a huge extent too. Yeah, that was the 3 questions.
Thank you. We have 7 questions, so I'd maybe pose the first 3 and then let's see if we can have time for more. And the first one was directed only for me in a direct message, so you probably didn't read it. It's from Fadila. How can we deal with the dilemma of achieving resonance as educators in post-colonial societies where there is interference of neoliberal ideologies on the one hand and authoritarian regimes on the other hand? Okay. Then from Ana Paula Silva, who participated in our workshop with Carlos Alberto Torres and posed this question back then. I would like Professor Rosa to reflect between ethics and aesthetics influence in the concept of resonance. And Ingrid Garcia poses this question, what about resilience and resonance in negative environments? So in the negative forms, not only in the positive forms. Do you think you can accommodate more questions, or we stay with these 3?
I think let me answer these 3 quickly and then go to the others. Yes, okay.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe the third and the first are related, right? How can we deal with it, or how can we kind of create atmospheres of resonance in oppressive conditions, and also with the neoliberal pressures, of course, which we all feel, right? I mean, of course, I mean, we cannot simply solve the problems, right? I mean, like Adorno always said, there is no, es gibt kein richtiges Leben im Falschen. There is no right way of living or being in wrong conditions, right? So there is no perfect solution to the problem, but I'm quite optimistic. It's something I found, I always, I like to quote Leonard Cohen, the singer and songwriter at this point, who says, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And my claim is that in all contexts we interact, even in oppressive ones, there is always a small crack, which is an opening for resonance, right? So when we interact with students, there might be very bad background conditions. We are pressed for time, there's loud noise, there is the parents, there is the teacher, whatever it is, right? But there is always the chance for a small form of encounter, for giving the kid a chance to raise his or her voice, right? For taking away his anxiety, maybe, right? But also when we talk to colleagues, when we reflect on a subject matter, no matter how pressed we are, there's always a small opening. You know, when I said resonance is uncontrollable, and I meant we cannot enforce it, we cannot instrumentally bring it about, but I really claim you can never kind of completely kill it. The uncontrollability also means there's always the possibility of small elements of resonance in all of these axes. And my hope is, I think what we should do, our ethical obligation is to pick on these small openings, right? Whatever it is, to make them bigger, to recreate those situations and possibilities, to allow resonance to happen along these axes, right? Resonance between students, resonance between students and teachers, resonance between teacher and teacher, resonance between teacher and the outside environment. And by picking on these small openings, I hope we create really resilient resistance against the oppressive factors. The question is, you know, this is why I'm interested in energy. How can we, in bad conditions, under very bad and negative conditions, how can we muster the energy that really says no to the oppressors, right, and to the oppressing conditions? I believe this energy is raised, it's created or released in moments of interactions which are resonant, right? If you have a kind of if you have one lesson, right, where you really feel the resonance in the classroom, it might very well kind of go beyond the classroom and extend to the school, and go beyond the school and extend to the community you live in. So that's my hope, right? Yeah, with the resilience, I mean, it depends on how you interpret resilience. I'm a bit skeptical, because resilience, I think, has been picked on a lot by neoliberals, right? Who use it that it's the individual who has to be resilient in negative conditions, and then you don't fight the conditions, but you increase your resilience, right? So I'm always a bit skeptical about this. And also, when you define resilience as the capacity to stay the same or to stay untouched in problematic conditions, I would say that's against resonance too. I don't want to stay untouched and untransformed, right? But of course, I don't want to be touched and transformed as a pure victim, right? So privately, I don't really use the resilience concept a lot, but there are definitions of resilience which come very close to resonance, right? I mean, so of course, I've discussed it in 2 or 3 workshops recently, resilience and resonance, and I've been convinced that some people use resilience almost exactly in the way I use resonance too. And I tried to say already how we can create more of this form of resilience out of the crack which is in everything. The questions on ethics and aesthetics is very interesting, because I really think it's also very interesting, because I think resonance is right at the intersection, it encompassing both. Because sometimes people say, isn't resonance simply an aesthetic experience, right? Something that touches me, right, and transforms me. Of course, sometimes I use the examples of music touching me and maybe transforming me, or a landscape, or even a movie or something of this sort. So yes, there can be a kind of, and art, for me, art is one of the existential dimensions of resonance, right? So yes, resonance is something that is involved in, connected to aesthetic experience. But of course, it also has this ethical dimension, right? But like Levinas and of course others, but Levinas would be a good example for this, right? It's being called by the other in a certain sense, the face of the other or the eyes of another. They carry a kind of obligation. And I also claim that resonance, the sense of resonance, implicitly carries an ethics of resonance, right? This is one of the tools I want to work with. I claim that when you're in resonance with something, you immediately develop a sense of caring, or a care ethics, because you don't want to destroy, you want to preserve the other in its independence almost in its autonomy. If you're in love with someone, right, you of course want to do everything you can to preserve it. You might even be willing to sacrifice yourself in order to preserve this others. And if you're in resonance with something, let's say a plant, I always make this example, which is of course very European middle class, but if I walk in the mountains and I love the mountains, right, I will not step on a flower just to get a nice Instagram or Snapchat picture, right? Because being in resonance with it means I have the desire almost to preserve it, right? So resonance is an ethical attitude. It's a care ethical disposition, I would say, and it's an aesthetic experience. It brings together these two, at least these two realms. That's why I really want to kind of make resonance the kind of meta criterion on the normative meta criterion.
Thank you. So I'd pose the last one because it's related to this last response you gave by Alexandra. The philosopher Spinoza teaches us that an ethics is only possible with and within the affections, without denying them or repressing them. Was there an influence of Spinoza for the creation of the resonance theory? And then we have 3 questions much more related to the educational realm. Wen Xiao says, thank you, Professor Rosa, for your interesting and inspiring sharing. My question is, what's the difference or relationship between resonance and dialogue in Freire's theory? Then from Yue Zhang, thank you, Professor Rosa. I wonder that is alienation taking place in education? What are the visible signs of educational alienation in an accelerating society? And then a longer comment by Yi Hao Li. I have one question about resonance in praxis. Professor Rosa proposed 4 axes in his book Resonance, which we had discussed in Professor Torres' seminar in 2020. As for these 4 axes, the social, physical, existential, and the self-axis, I hope to ask how to transform these 4 axes in real praxis of education. For example, our education is dominated by competition and instrumental rationality. This is why we meet the burnout or depression dilemma. We understand the importance of resonance, but how to address and what if the appeal for resonance with others contradicts the appeals to survive and not competition?
Okay, so the question here is how to open up the 4. I hope to ask how to transform these 4 axes in real praxis. Yeah, okay. Yeah, maybe I start with the last one. I do it in reverse order, right? Yeah, well, I mean, or actually, I start with the alienation signs, and then we can go to the axis, right? I mean, the alienation signs you see I think you see very clearly. I mean, you can see it in many aspects, right? I mean, alienation, as I said, is when you have the feeling, or when someone has the feeling. Actually, it can be the student or the teacher. Schools have become places of enormous alienation for teachers too, right? I mean, and what are the signs? You can see it from yourself, right? Or from the teacher can see it from herself or from himself. So you go to school and you realize, I mean, the first clear sign is it's a place you don't want to be. Alienation for me, maybe I didn't define it in this sense. Alienation for me has 2 dimensions or 2 forms. One is indifference. It doesn't, for example, I could say Beethoven, it doesn't speak to me at all. I don't know, I can listen to it, but it doesn't have any affection. So it's indifference, right? And the other is hostility, or I call it repulsion, right? It's repulsive, right? So signs of alienation is when you have these 2 signs, right? I'm totally indifferent, or I don't want to go there. When I see the school, I already feel nausea, right? Or when I smell it or so, right? I don't want to talk to my colleagues. They always have the same 4 sayings on their mouths, right? I don't want to, for example, when teachers suffer burnout, they very often they say, the problem was I invested so much energy, but nothing came back. Right, this nothing came back is a very clear sign of alienation, and this is what leads to burnout in the end, right? So whether it's students or teachers, when they have this feeling, I don't want to be here, it's a clear sign of alienation, right? And why don't you want to be here? On the one hand, because now maybe we can switch sides and go to the students. They would say all the things they teach me at class don't speak to me, right? The alienation there has two forms. One is I'm totally disinterested. I would want to play with my friends, or I have to work to make a living, and I really don't care about the physics stuff I should teach, right? So it's clear indifference there. It doesn't speak to me. The other sense of alienation is I just can't do it. I don't know mathematics. I'm incapable. I'm too stupid, right? That's a form of alienation, right? So basically, you can see particularly those who lose in our educational systems. They are those who feel alienation in this double sense. On the one hand, they feel the teachers don't like me, or they don't even see me. I once analyzed rock music songs, and even you can take rap songs too. They're totally full. Oh, I have a good idea to answer the question with the 4 axes. They are totally full of experiences of alienation, where either the teachers and the classmates hate me, or they don't see me. Like in Gary Jules in Mad World, they look right through me, right? Or Pink Floyd, we don't need your education. They are put into this machine which makes them into pulp or meat or so, right? So those are experiences of alienation. Now the question was, how can we transform it under oppressive conditions? I mean, probably it's a pity. I think it has probably been translated, but probably you don't know it. There is a German movie, the most successful German movie of all times, right? It has come out about maybe 10 years ago or 8 years ago, right? It is called Fuck You Goethe. Fuck You Goethe, right? The poet. And I think this really was the most successful. No German movie got a greater audience. And there you could really see the power of education, the problem of education, and how you can open up the access. And the story, I have to tell the story very quickly, right? The story goes like this. There is one class it's a school which is already in a very problematic area. It's almost a slum, the only slum we have in Germany, right? And it's the worst class there. No teacher wants to go there. All the teachers really basically they flee, because the students do everything they can to kind of to violate or to denigrate the teacher. And students have no interest whatsoever in the school subjects, right? So now something funny happens. There is a robber, a thief, right, who has buried a kind of a treasure's money underneath the school. So he only wants to get the money. He's certainly not interested in the kids, and he's not interested in Goethe, the poet, or so at all. But he has to teach this class. So he goes there and he doesn't care about students at all. Students hate him, he hates them. No one cares about Goethe, right? So it's all the axes of resonance are closed. It's complete alienation, indifference, or hostility. And now you can see that now, of course, the movie is about opening up. It's a kind of caricature. It's almost, it's a comedy, but it speaks to something truly human. The axes of resonance gradually open up. All of a sudden, the teacher, who is a thief and a robber, realizes, oh, these poor kids, right? They are human beings, right? They all of a sudden resonance agrees. He starts to care for them. One of the kids wants drugs and asks him, and he says, "You are too young. You shouldn't take drugs, right?" And this is how it starts. He starts to really listen to them, to care for them, and all of a sudden, teachers realize, as students realize, oh, this guy out there, he doesn't just want to teach us in the banking model. He really cares for us, right? And then all of a sudden they interact, and the robber says, "I'll take you to a drug addict. I'll show you what you get by it," right? So they go there and they make some certain experience and they reflect on it. And all of a sudden, the Goethe book, which lies there, I can't remember why it was, they start to appropriate it and they read it in a totally different way from what the head teacher wants them, right? But in the end, you can really see education happening, right? The axis of resonance open up. And I found that while the rock songs and the rap songs, the pop music is all about alienation, almost all the movies, the Dead Poets Society, it is exactly the same story, right? An alienating atmosphere, and all of a sudden, resonance starts, resonance with the poems, right? And resonance between students and resonance between students and teachers. So I believe the educational setting always allows creating resonance between people. It's social resonance towards the subject matters we deal with. And in the end, also a kind of allowing students to listen to themselves, right? To their memories, to their bodies, to their psyches is the greatest gift you can give to them. I'm optimistic that it's the very logic of educational building which enables it even under adverse conditions. Resonance and dialogue. Yeah, I think the Freire model. I mean, I'm not a complete expert on Freire, right? I mean, for him, of course, he has something which I have not really developed very well, and that's the dialectic between oppressor and oppressed, right? For my model, I have to say, it might be a flaw, right? It starts by the idea that it must be capable to interact on a par, right, on one level. So I think Freire just has paid more attention to this. And then the one big difference I see, if I don't misread Freire, is that for Freire, dialogue is social. It's between human beings, right? While resonance has these other dimensions, being in resonance with yourself. You could say it's being in dialogue with yourselves, but there I think it's not just dialogue. It's feeling and finding answers in practice. But of course, I also have this sense of material resonance, right? Resonating with things and resonating with nature. And there, I think it goes, it's different from the dialogue conception. And with Spinoza, that's interesting too. I'm not a Spinozian, right? And as Spinoza, I'm of course in studying philosophy, I've encountered him and read parts of him, but I've not been deeply influenced by him. But then when I did the resonance book and when I discussed it with many people, I realized that there really is a lot of affinities in the conception of affection, of affect, of course, even in what I try to do right now. I mean, then of course, in the kind of relational reality concept, in his concept. I mean, if I say that all of reality is a kind of is a possibility or a field of resonance, it sounds almost like a Spinozian idea. But right now, when I want to turn to energy, kind of come up with a conception of energy, it's certainly worthwhile looking to Spinoza again. So I wouldn't say that I'm a Spinozian already, but I'm quite inclined to go back there and study him more closely, and maybe I'll come out as a Spinozian when I have written my energy book.
So may we have an additional minute? E. Howley wrote another one.
Okay.
One more essential question for me is how to construct resonance upon the precondition of inequality and hierarchy. Humans' needs are always very contingent and ranked in different manners. And Felisberto also writes just now, so interesting seminar, thank you for so much. The millennial Ubuntu African philosophy teaches us that we are only and always with others. That means our relationship with humanity and nature. Do you see points of contact between this and the resonance theory?
Okay, so one is the question how to construct resonance upon the precondition of inequality and hierarchy. Yeah, I mean, the problem, I mean, what is the, oh yeah, Ubuntu African philosophy. Yes, yes, I think, I mean, with this Ubuntu, yeah, this is what I mean, right? This is exactly what I have in mind. I want to overcome the ethnocentricity of European thinking of critical theory. Critical theory is very you could say, make this point, Amy Allen does it, right? And I want to overcome it, and I hope that resonance is a concept with which we can do it. And Ubuntu certainly is a tradition and a context and a practice which has a lot of affinities with resonance. I find a dialogue between Ubuntu and with this philosophy and resonance theory could be most interesting. It should, and then I haven't done it yet, but I would really love to do it. Right? I really believe there could be resonance between the resonance concept and the Ubuntu philosophy, which maybe it helps to transform maybe both sides, at least the resonance conception, right? So that I would like a lot. This other thing, yeah, I mean, of course, that's difficult. I mean, how to construct resonance upon the precondition of inequality and hierarchy. I mean, the problem is, I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I mean, inequality, my hope would be that opening up the axis of resonance could exactly be the mean to overcome injustice and inequality. You know, I have colleagues in Jena, they are very leftist and neo-Marxist, and kind of we agree that capitalism and imperialism, they create two problems. One is inequality and injustice, which it's increasing all the time, right? And it's frightening, and it's also unbearable. And the other is alienation, a wrong form of being in the world and being to the world. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is really a question which is open for me, right? But I have an idea. I mean, my colleagues, Klaus Dörre, for example, he always would argue that we have to solve the injustice first, overcome hierarchy and inequality, and then we can care for alienation. And then they make it sound like alienation and resonance are kind of problems of luxury problems, right? Resonance is something the elites, the middle classes might care for. But those who really struggle in totally oppressive conditions, they don't have the time, the capacity to care for resonance. I believe that's a kind of epistemic, I would almost say epistemic arrogance, because people, even under poorest conditions, know what resonance is, right? They are human beings. They resonate. Maybe you find more resonance in the slum than you find in the, in the upper classes. I would really think so, right? Because resonance is a mode of being in the world and being to the world. And it's not true that you have to have a lot of money or leisure time to develop it as an add-on. I tried to, actually, when I was in Brazil, I was with this landless community, but also with those who are garbage collectors in Porto Alegre, for example. And I think they immediately understand and know what resonance could be, and they tell it from their own lives, being treated like garbage, which means being treated as something completely non-resonant. That's kind of the worst of human form of existence. So I think resonance certainly isn't a luxurious quality, but I understand the question in a sense, what do you do when you live under conditions in which you are denied even the possibility to enter into a relationship of resonance, because there's a hierarchy which says India, we do cooperate from the Max Weber Colleague with India. I will go there in September again. Of course, there you see the huge problem that some people from the lower castes, or even the Dalits, they are treated like by the upper classes as stones, right? They are non-resonant beings, certainly not something you should get in resonance with. You cannot really solve that problem, I would say, by the means of resonance, by the tools of resonance. I mean, of course, we can always try to convince others, but if it really comes to a condition where there's complete denial, there you might at the end eventually be forced to fight for the creation of conditions of resonance again, right? But nevertheless, when I talked about the struggle with my colleagues, I believe that the problem of alienation or a mode of aggression and alienation is what creates and maintains the structures of hierarchy and inequality. Therefore, if we should really manage to overcome the mode of aggression and replace it by a mode of resonance, then hierarchy and inequality would more or less be felt as unbearable and disappear. I mean, at least that's my hope. Of course, it might be too optimistic. Yeah, Ubuntu and these were the two, right? Yeah, okay.
Yes, we are very advanced in time, but we have just received another question.
Okay, but
this
then we should really stop, okay?
Yes, sure. Yeah, thank you so much for this seminar. Thank you, Professor Hartmut Rosa. Thank you, Professor Carlos Alberto Torres. I don't know if Professor Antonio Teodoro wants to say a word. Okay.
No, but if there's one more question, it's okay. I think.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So it says, thank you, Professor Rosa, for the opportunity to learn more. My question is, as you spoke about the acceleration of modern life, I would like to hear your opinion on a topic that is certainly the most urgent of humanity: climate change and the increasing destruction of life on the planet. Faced with the multidimensional social effects of the phenomena resulting from the so-called capitalocene, as his theory of resonance interprets, and may contribute to transforming the paradox of the majority of the world population, even impacted by the increasingly destructive results of this acceleration production mode, passively accepts and applauds the system itself causing this destruction?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is, I think this is the core, and I've really now come to think that this is the core question of our civilization and of our future, right? And right now, I mean, I always say I'm quite an optimistic guy, even so some of my writings are very pessimistic, because along the lines you ask there, right? I've always thought, but we will be able, if humanity was able to fly, right? Because human beings are not made for flying, but we have come to make it. Then we should be able to overcome a problem which we have created by ourselves, namely the capitalist system or this logic of acceleration. But now I've really, for the first time in my life, turned completely pessimistic when it comes to global politics. I mean, if you now take to war, I mean, to hot war in Ukraine, I mean, I know there's been war all over the world all the time, right? But now it's really major powers going against each other. And I always hear from the United States and from Europe that it's not just Russia, we also have to go against China. And that means cold or hot war all over the world. And in that sense, we will simply, I really think we should give up. I mean, if this is the future now, no longer negotiations, no longer the attempt to create a global security system, but just create Cold War again, then, I mean, that's it. Then we will never overcome I mean, that's why now, for example, in Europe, they talk about investing in coal, investing in fracking and so on. So, but in the end, I would say the problem you describe here, right? And even the applause comes from this mode of aggression, right? It comes from the idea that you know, I call it the AAA. It comes from two things. One, of course, from the capitalist structures, right? But they are kind of oppressive. But the question is, how do they create our mindset? And the mindset is this, what I call the AAA conception of the good life. It's the deeply entrenched conviction by the winner of the systems, by the winners as by the losers, right? It seems to me that we are convinced that life gets better with the increase of resources. I call it the AAA conception of the good life. But you can ask yourselves, when do you call something good? Right? We call something good when it increases the horizon of what we can make available or attainable or accessible. For example, if someone says, I've got a car now, people are inclined to say, oh, that's good. Why is it good? Because you can go greater. More of the world is available to you. If someone says, I got a higher income now, you would immediately say, oh, that's good. Congratulations. Why is it good? Because the income is really, it's the definition of your share of what you can appropriate from the world. Someone says, I got a faster internet connection. You would say, oh, that's wonderful. Why? Because it makes more of the world at a faster pace available, attainable, accessible. So I could go on for hours. Most people want to live in cities rather than in the rural areas. Why? Because in the city you have more of the human possibilities available, attainable, accessible. The opera, the theater, the cinema, whatever it is, even the factory, right? So this is our definition of the good life, making more available, attainable, accessible. And by this definition, it comes into interlocking with the capitalist structures which need growth, acceleration, and innovation. So what do? I think we will not solve the climate by treating it as a resource. We have to be careful with. I think we will only save the climate if we realize that nature is a sphere of resonance. We need this other, this independent voice of the other, which answers us. Because, you know, in nature, we experience agency, which is not us. And resonance requires this sense of agency, which is not us. And nature might be the last resort in which we have this agency. So I think we should do everything we can do to strengthen this sense, not of nature as a precarious resource, but as a sphere of resonance. And it's beyond the European imperialist Western thinking that we find vibrant conceptions of this sort of nature. So this is once again a good reason to go beyond the European Western form of thinking and talk to or look to post-colonial traditions. So thanks a lot from my side.
Thanks a lot. So you can read some comments of our participants. Thank you for your insightful seminar, for this inspiring moment. Thank you very much. I think we must close our session.
Yeah.
So this was a great seminar by Professor Hartmut Rosa and by Professor Carlos Alberto Torres, held within SAID, our Interdisciplinary Research Center for Education and Development at Lusófona University. It was a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much.